first thing to know about camera settings is know what you're gonna shoot beforehand. If you know what you're gonna shoot, you can determine better what your camera settings need to be. If you wanna shoot slow motion, you need a higher frame rate. If you wanna shoot a hectic action scene, you need a higher shutter speed. But the basic line is to get perfect exposure. Exposure results out of 3 basic camera settings which appear on your camera screen, which is shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. The shutter speed is the first number which appears on your screen, which is one portion of how fast your camera lets light onto your frame, which results in making your video darker when there's a high shutter speed and brighter when there's a lower shutter speed. Oh, so I can just use the shutter speed to light my videos and don't even touch the other settings. Okay, thanks, bye. Wait, it also introduces motion blur into the motions in your video. So the lower your shutter speed, the more motion blur you have. Proven to be the most pleasing to the eye, you usually use a shutter speed of double your frame rate. So if your frame rate is 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be at 1/50th of a second, which is the closest to 1/48th of a second. If you're shooting 50 frames per second, your shutter speed is 100. If you're shooting 60 frames per second, your shutter speed is 125. If you're shooting 120 frames per second, your shutter speed is 240, which is quick math. And I'm really bad at math. But 60 frames or higher doesn't really introduce much motion blur anymore into your motions, so you can just pump up your shutter speed if your frame is still too dark, too bright. So it doesn't really matter anymore. But if you're shooting at a normal frame rate like 24 or 30 frames per second, please leave it. Just leave it double. Leave it. So how do I get my frame darker then? Use an ND filter, but there's also 2 more settings to go. This one is the aperture. Aperture? The aperture also controls of how much light is going to be let into your frame. Have you ever seen a cat where the pupils go like... Basically, that's exactly what's happening here. So the pupil of your camera is called aperture. So the more light there is, the more you can close your aperture to darken your frame. Filmmakers, though, rarely use this for exposure since it's also having an impact of how much of your frame is going to be in focus. The aperture on your screen appears as a number, which is defined as an f-stop. So the lower this number, the more light will be let into your frame and the less depth of field you will have. Depth of field, how much of your frame is going to be in focus. If I put my hand right there, you can see all of this beautiful blurriness in the background here that everybody wants. But if you're flying a drone, for example, it's really hard to pull focus. So usually if a drone has a very high aperture and everything is in focus, or your phone camera, for example. You can test this out with your lens because every lens and every camera is different. But usually you gotta know what you're filming. If you're filming a house, you need a higher f-stop. If you're filming a bug, you need a very low f-stop. The last number of your screen is called the ISO. The ISO is just digitally brightening your screen when it's too dark. Have you tried to take a photo with your phone in the dark and it had all these little points all over and you didn't know why? That's basically the ISO trying to expose your frame properly. The tech is getting much better with this, but still, try to leave this number as low as possible since you don't want all these cute little spots all over your screen and screwing up your shoot. I usually shoot between 1 and 400 on the outside and a maximum of 800 on the inside. If you have to use a 20,000 ISO, you're probably on a place where it's too dark. So only use your ISO if your shutter speed and your aperture is already set perfectly the way you want it and your picture is still too dark. And time. 4 minutes and 42 seconds. Camera settings, check. Next one is going to be screen direction.